Hello, everyone. All right, let's go ahead and get started. I am delighted on behalf of the Historical Society of Pennsylvania to welcome all of you to tonight's program, Teaching Recent Women's History, a discussion and workshop. My name is Christina Larocco, and I here at HSP serve as the editor of the Pennsylvania Magazine of History and Biography and the Scholarly Programs Manager. A little bit of background about HSP if you have not joined us before. HSP was founded in 1824 and proudly serves as Philadelphia's Library of American History. Our collection contains over 21 million manuscripts that hold stories of all Americans, with a particular emphasis on early American history, ethnic and minority groups, genealogical research, science, industry, and the arts. Our collections come alive when you use them in your classrooms, your research, and your publications. A couple of housekeeping notes. Closed captioning is available if you click on the CC button. We will be recording today's program. I'll remind you of this when it comes time for audience members to participate. We are recording, and the recording will be sent to you in a follow-up email. There are going to be 2 times during the program tonight that we'll ask for your participation. The first is after the discussion that the panelists and I are going to have, and then the second is going to be after the exercise that will comprise the second part of the program. You can feel free to, when it's time for audience contributions, you can feel free either to raise your hand or put your name in the Q&A, and we will promote you to panelists so you can ask your question live. We are in webinar mode, which means that we cannot see you and you cannot see each other. Thus, once we start the workshop, we'll want to bring you on screen before you ask your question. All right, so I'm going to say just a little bit about where this program came from, the rationale, and how it came to take the shape that it did. And after that, I'll introduce our wonderful panelists. So the idea for this program came from a number of different sources. First, and most obviously, it's not only Women's History Month, but also International Women's Day, which acknowledges the contributions of the global women's rights movement. Second, I did want to do a little bit of self-promotion and have the opportunity to tell you about my new book, The Women's Rights Movement Since 1945, a reference guide, which offers resources for educators at both the secondary and post-secondary levels. There's a flyer at the end of your packet that's in the Google folder. And participants in this program only can contact me directly to receive 20% off. And I should say also the exercises that we'll be doing later on and that we've provided for you to take back to your classrooms draw on the book as well. So the specific shape and content of this program had different origins, and I want to tell a brief story to illustrate one of them. As I began to plan this program, I came across a lesson plan from a very reputable source on Pauli Murray. I thought, wonderful. Pauli Murray is one of the most important women you can possibly include in any sort of women's history lecture. But I noticed that the lesson included the following disclaimer, and here I'm quoting. Be sure to preview this material and check your state and local regulations before using this content with your students. This resource contains material that may be sensitive for some students. Teachers should exercise discretion in evaluating whether this resource is suitable for their class. End quote. It's not difficult to surmise what this sensitive content is. The lesson explicitly discusses Murray's gender and sexual identities, both of which evolved over the course of her life. Without a doubt, Murray was one of the most influential figures of the 20th century. Among her many accomplishments, she provided a crucial part of the legal framework the NAACP used in Brown v. Board, helped secure the inclusion of sex in Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, coined the term Jane Crow, developed new ways of applying the 14th Amendment to women's rights, and became the first African-American woman to be ordained an Episcopal priest. What do we as historians and educators lose without polyamory? What do we lose every time an educator looks at that content and perhaps wants to use it and decides they can't? Only, I would argue, the ability to explain the entire second half of the 20th century. Finally, this program emerged from the fact that as I was working on my book, it kept getting out of date very, very quickly. In the final round of revisions with my editor, Randall Miller, whom I'm sure many of you know, I added a new section about how the COVID-19 pandemic exposed women's still unequal share of caregiving responsibilities. Then, after I received page proofs, I added another section. You're not supposed to do this as an editor. Please don't, but I did. Making changes once you're at the proof stage is very time consuming and expensive for the press, and it's very discouraged. However, on June 24th of last year, the Supreme Court issued its decision in Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health, possibly the most significant ruling to affect women's lives in the past 50 years. I couldn't not include it. Shortly thereafter, I read an article in Education Week that connected these two experiences, these warnings about teaching polyamory and these experiences of living through very rapid changes in the history of women's rights. As Sarah Schwartz reports in How the Overturning of Roe v. Wade Will Reverberate Through Classrooms, the majority of the states do not include the 1973 decision in their social studies teaching standards. Now, with many states imposing restrictions on teaching controversial issues, teachers might be even less likely to address this topic. According to Sheila Edwards, a middle school history teacher, quote, "History teachers in particular are feeling a lot of pressure and feel like there's a magnifying glass on what they're doing," end quote. Edwards remembered that an event held last summer for teachers to discuss how to address Roe and Dobbs, quote, "There were some teachers who were in tears saying, 'I know what I should do, but I don't know if I can do it,' end quote." When and how should teachers discuss recent women's history in their classrooms? As debates about, among other topics, women's healthcare and LGBTQ rights rage, educators are especially motivated to include lessons on the history of these issues. Yet at the same time, states and localities have imposed new restrictions on school curricula, especially matters related to race, gender, and sexuality. How can teachers respond to these challenges? What can and should they say in their classrooms about this history? Tonight, we're going to address these questions in two different ways, both of which assume that regardless of what are surely divergent personal views that we all hold, we all believe that history should be told in full, including the parts that we do not like. So first, a panel of experts and I will discuss teaching and learning women's history against the backdrop of today's political, legal, and social context. And then we're going to model one of three activities my colleagues and I have developed from HSP collections for you to bring back to your own classrooms. So I will ask the panelists to come on screen, and I will go ahead and introduce them. This is a really great group. We're very lucky to have them. All right, wonderful. So first, Alexandra.
Municipal purpose. It may be to try to eliminate books that talk about children or adults or transgender relationships. It may be to eliminate books that talk about the civil rights movement or slavery. That cannot stand. So courts consider the context of the proposed policy and what it says about the motivation of the policymakers. And that is true also in the curriculum context. If there is an attempt by policymakers to sort of have their views supersede everything, that's an indication that there is an ulterior motive at play. So the First Amendment requires central school districts to have established, regular, facially unbiased procedures governing the removal of non-curricular books. Book removals by school districts that rely on irregular procedures that don't have standards, that don't have a review process, those would violate First Amendment protections. So I think it's important to underscore that. Now, if we look at some of the examples, and I'm going to touch on this just a little because I know there are other questions and I don't want to spend all the time on it, but Central Bucks and Penn Ridge, and there are other examples where school districts have adopted some very controversial policies, including something called an anti-advocacy policy, where they're saying that teachers and students cannot engage in advocacy. There's a directive in Central Bucks to educators not to use students' correct gender pronouns without parent permission. We also see this in Southside area school district, and we see that also happening other places. So there's also an anti-advocacy policy that's resulted in banning any pride flags. In January, a school district in Central Bucks, a high school librarian, said that he was directed to take down posters with a quote from a Holocaust survivor and peace advocate, Eli Wiesel, in January because they violated the advocacy policy. Librarian, there's a factual dispute as to exactly what happened, but the librarian felt that there would be consequences if he did not comply, and he complied with that directive. They have also taken steps in Central Bucks to eliminate library books. The first were 5 library books, 4 of which centered on characters who identified as LGBTQ. Now we have 65 challenged books in Central Books, and a lot of them appear on what's called the Book Looks website. And that is a site that is focused on banning library books as, quote, objectionable and containing sexual content. Moms for Liberty is one of the national organizations that is actually a part of Book Looks, but that is sort of leading the charge on book bans, not just in Pennsylvania, but throughout the country. Unfortunately, Pennsylvania ranks 3rd in the country in terms of book bans and the number of book bans that we have. So we see these actions. They're also in Central Books. That's the subject of a federal complaint that's been filed, administrative complaint filed by ACLU, alleging that the district has in fact created a hostile environment for students who identify as LGBTQ. There was, and I do want to say that 52 school board directors from 25 Pennsylvania school districts have actually condemned Central Bucks school board majority for fostering, quote, intolerance, discrimination, and targeting LGBTQ students for political purposes. We see this also in Penn Ridge, where the school district has also adopted very, very similar anti-advocacy policy. They are also looking at book bans. Also in Penn Ridge, the curricula that they are talking about adopting is called the Hillsdale 1776 curriculum. It's a very conservative, ultra conservative curriculum. It actually does not talk about the civil rights movement. It talks about sort of from a very white supremacist view, in my opinion. It talks about the history from that angle, and it eliminates all of the information that we all need that talks about slavery and talks about really the root injustice in this country and how this country was formed. So I know that was a long answer to your question, but I thought it would be helpful to provide a little bit of context and overview to start out the conversation. I hope that was helpful. Thanks.
It's a fantastic overview. Thank you. I was struck in particular by how insightful your comments on vagueness and what a particular vagueness in a piece of legislation might imply. And you can really see there how insidious these restrictions can be, even if you perhaps don't teach or go to school somewhere where they're in place, or you do, but you don't know exactly what they mean. You see how it can lead to self-censorship as well. So I thought that was really interesting. That's actually a perfect segue to take a look at what's happening on the ground in school districts where we see these policies implemented. So Alexandra, you're in Central Bucks County. And as Maura mentioned, this is in Pennsylvania, probably the best known controversy that has been unfolding over the past couple of years. Now, I know that you personally have been involved along with your classmates in protesting book bans. You've also been active in protests against the Dobbs decision. So can you tell me or tell us a little bit about how students and the extent to which you're aware of it, how teachers in your school have been responding to these new restrictions, and in turn, how school officials have responded to your political activism?
Yeah, of course. I think a lot of students, especially Black and Brown and queer students, are just like completely horrified by what's happening right now in our school district. I think at first a lot of us kind of found it funny, like when they didn't have like the 66 books that they were talking about, like possibly removing from the library. Like we were reading some of the descriptions of the books and like what on a website like Book Looks that was mentioned, and like we were reading the descriptions of why people think that they should be removed from our libraries, and we were kind of like laughing at them because we just found it so kind of, this isn't the best word, but like stupid, I guess. And now it's just kind of completely appalling what's going on. I will say that some students like don't know about the restrictions just because they are, kind of caught up with that stuff. Some just kind of don't care. And others are, like children of school board members or politicians or whatever that think like the same way that they do and support the restrictions. I say that a majority of like the teachers in my school district definitely care, that they're very supportive of students and like don't support the restrictions, but they're very afraid to outwardly show that, especially the ones that don't have tenure, and they aren't really sure how to show their support to students without losing their job. I will say others do have tenure and they're not afraid to be like supportive and speak their mind and allow students to be who they are in their classrooms. Regarding like school officials responding to our activism, I would say some are supportive, and like the teachers, they don't really want to crack down on us, but they're stuck between a rock and a hard place, like they're afraid of losing their jobs, while others are like supportive of the restrictions. They want to enforce them and do not really take kindly to people having like walkouts or protests or having club conversations about the stuff that's been happening in our district.
Thank you, Alexandra. I'm skipping around a little bit here because I really want to go from that to some subject matter specificity. So Keziah, what I would like to ask you about is the specific problems that women's history as a discipline has historically had. It's historically been plagued by its focus on middle class, white, cis hetero women, and these new curricular restrictions seem almost designed, or perhaps they are designed to exacerbate this problem. I raised the example of Pauline Murray in my introductory remarks. What advice would you give to educators who want to teach an inclusive women's history, especially in states or localities where they might face retribution for doing so?
Well, so I think this is like a twofold question. I think let's start with thinking about the history that we've had thus far in regards to Black women and their contribution to various movements, whether it's the suffrage movement or the abolitionist movement. And I think one way to sort of drive home the point that it's woefully misrepresenting the role and impact of Black women is to think about the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society. So right now, my students are actually working on a project where the goal was to actually submit an application to the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission to have the plaque that currently exists for the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society edited to include Black women. Right now, as the plaque currently reads, it only has Lucretia Mott's name as the one who founded it. And also the way that it reads, you would not be able to tell that it was a multiracial organization that was founded by several Black women, including Charlotte Vanden Fortin, the wife of James Fortin, as well as their 3 daughters, and with huge, I should say, support and contributions from women like the Douglas, Grace Bustillo Douglas. So in doing something like that, it's important to understand that Black women history has always sort of been pushed to the back burner. In this particular case, unfortunately, they have just paused that program, the marker program. So we're still going through with the project, and the hope would be to highlight how important the program is and how there's still a lot of work that needs to be done for our historical markers. And hopefully they'll reopen it soon, and we will be able to submit an application to have a Black woman's name that helps to found PFAS added to the plaque, and also the wording of it was a multiracial organization. I think in thinking of things like that and using that as an example, and then coming forward to where we are today, I think that these laws that are being passed make it really, really hard to include Black women history, especially if those Black women are intersectional and are maybe within the LGBTQ community, in addition to being Black women activists. And so in a lot of states, you would not be able to teach that history because there are so many laws in place that are restricting that. So for instance, students wouldn't be able to learn about Marsha P. Johnson. And that is somebody that I teach IB social and cultural anthropology, but I just had a student who is the IB diploma candidate do her paper on Marsha P. Johnson and Laverne Cox, and talk about how, over time and through different eras, women have been allowed to showcase more of their full self and their identity while also being activists within the movement. And so her being able to do a paper like that in some states would not have been allowed just because of the content of her paper. And so I think that it's really important for teachers, if they are in states where these things are being restricted, to ask themselves some really important questions. One of those questions being, why did you get into the education field? Obviously, we want to be able to feed our family, and we want to make sure that our career is able to move forward. But I really think that it's important to stand up for and push back against these laws and this ideology that is threatening to really derail a lot of the work that we've been able to sort of accomplish over the last few decades. When I think about the group United Daughters of the Confederacy, which was founded, I believe, in 1982, that sort of had such a huge impact on textbooks and had such a huge impact on history and how that history was told, where it was heavily skewed towards the Confederacy and towards teaching a false history that we're still working to correct even to this day. I think that we have to be really, really careful about allowing laws like this to come into place, because as we all know, it can be very hard to get rid of them once that happens. I think we're in a very sort of peculiar place because our Supreme Court looks very different from what I think some people would prefer. And with that being the case, even though it is supposed to be a non-political body, we all know that oftentimes politics does come into play. And so with these laws, if it does make it to the Supreme Court through appeal, it's going to be very hard to get them off of the books. And so I think we have to decide as a society, what do we want our children to learn? What is important for them? If you want your child to grow up to be a productive and enlightened member of society who believes in logic and reason and having the facts and not, arguing off of fake news, then it's important that the proper history is taught. So I think what I would say to teachers is, if you can resist in whatever method that you have at your disposal. Because if we don't, then we're looking at a very bleak future where our children are being taught histories that are inaccurate and that are very limiting in scope. And that will very, very much be to the detriment of critical thinking and developing analyzation skills. History is uncomfortable. It's supposed to be, because it's literally talking about how horrible human beings have been to each other for decades and centuries. And so starting off with understanding that history is uncomfortable is a segue into, it is uncomfortable, but let's talk about it and let's work through it, because at the other end of the discomfort is a development of multiple points of view, of understanding those multiple points of view. And so, you know, as a teacher, I also want to just be able to support those teachers in whatever way I can. So if there is a fund to help pay legal fees, I'm going to be donating to that. And I encourage other teachers who live in states where this is not an issue, or live in cities where we're more insulated than others, we should be doing everything that we can to support those teachers.
Thank you, Keziah. I'm really grateful in particular for the specific examples that you provided. Marsha P. Johnson, especially, that's very powerful. And I can't imagine history without these figures. The Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society is also a terrific example. And it's very hard to believe that there were no Black women included on the marker. I'm sure you know, but for the rest of you who might not know, we actually have their papers at HSP. Many of them are digitized. It's one of my very favorite collections. So I'm really glad that you brought that up. Maura, when we think about issues like sexuality, which we've talked about a bit, and reproductive history and the history of reproductive rights, to what extent is there a danger that teachers may be restricted in their ability to discuss these topics?
Well, I kind of think everything is up for grabs right now, you know, and that people, I mean, they're going in directions I don't think anyone anticipated, right? So there is a movement to really narrow the focus of what our history is, what reproductive rights are, what our sexuality is. And it's this attempt to really, sometimes from a minority of people, but that get on school boards and that are adopting these policies. So do I think this can impact teaching of, you know, reproductive rights and history of reproductive rights? Sure, absolutely. Because it's really, it seems to be, from the perspective and the discussions that we have had, really trying to reinvent history, not telling an accurate story. I mean, the harm that's being done to the students who are living it, right, who are seeing their history, them erased, right? It's, you don't have a history. You didn't, you know, we are not focused on you. We're focusing on the white males, cisgender males, right? So we have that impact, that harm. We have the harm, which Keziah mentioned, which is also, we're not learning critical thinking. We're not learning accurate history. We're not learning skills to deal with different points of view. So we're doing harm to not only the children who are, to all of the children, obviously, who are sitting in that classroom. We're doing harm to our school communities. We're doing harm to creating places that are hostile, that are not places of trust, not places where people can voice their opinions. So we're really, you know, we're undermining our democracy. We're undermining and ensuring that students have the skills when they leave to be able to engage in a vibrant democracy, and that they value that, because that's what happens if you grow up this way, that you then don't value that. So we're doing a lot of harm. But to answer your question, yes, certainly that is possible, because that's not the perspective that we are seeing from the curriculum, from that conservative perspective, from the book looks sort of, what is their priority and what they're banning and what they're trying to get rid of. So it's very much undervaluing women. It's undervaluing people of color, Black and brown students. It's undervaluing the gender identity of trans students, bisexual students, all of that is happening. So non-binary. So and that's like the pronouns that you see, where it's like, you can't use these pronouns. So they're actual, like Southside area school district is an example of that. You're not allowed as a teacher to use those pronouns of the child who is telling you, this is how I present. They're not allowed to use those pronouns. That's the policy that they're pushing right now. So you're finding all of these things happening. And to the extent that they are successful, they will be replicated. So we saw what happened in Central Bucks, and then we saw a similar policy 321, like whack-a-mole, kind of crop up in another school district, because these policies are being shared across the country. So you're seeing a lot of them in Florida, you're seeing a lot of them in certain states, and now we are also seeing them in Pennsylvania. Others may have better ideas on this. That's my view.
Let me ask Alexandra, to what extent do you feel like you are getting the education you need to understand today's controversial issues? You've been very politically active, so you're certainly aware of what's happening. You're certainly aware of the historical context of the Dobbs decision and other developments of that nature. Are you and your classmates getting the information that you need to be able to participate in this country's politics? And if not, how can we help?
Honestly, I don't really think that we are getting like the full idea of like history in our classrooms. I think a lot of the stuff that's happening right now is kind of like hush hush, and we're not really supposed to talk about it. Like, our teachers aren't supposed to talk about it. We're not like supposed to learn context behind it, and just basically what's happening in our own school district. We're not supposed to talk about it. So yeah, I don't really think that we're getting like the education that we need right now, which is sad. But I think that everyone can kind of help by, having like events like these, having webinars and like bringing awareness to these kinds of issues, and just like teachers talking about these things to their students if they're able to, and like not fearing or losing their job. But yeah, I think basically just bringing awareness and making sure that we're talking about everything that's happening as much as we can.
That's really interesting. So it's not just the history or other curricular areas that are being restricted. It's a discussion of the restriction. There are restrictions on your ability to discuss the restrictions. That's a really interesting distinction that I had not really thought of. Keziah, I wanted to ask you, I read this great interview with you. I think it may have been on CNN, where you talked about how you'll occasionally have parents come to you saying, why did you teach my student that Christopher Columbus was a murderer? And you got this great quote that you say, I didn't teach them anything. Christopher Columbus's diary taught them that. So as someone who works in an archive, who's surrounded by primary documents all the time, why are primary documents important? How can they help to prepare students for today's controversial issues? What sort of context do they need? Talk a little bit about that.
Yes, I almost forgot about that. Yeah, I have. Yes, that has happened. And that's why I love primary sources so much. And I think that primary sources need to be utilized in class a lot more than they do. I think it's interesting because I feel like before there was this huge focus on textbooks. I know definitely that was the case within the school district of Philadelphia. We did have our primary sources, but we more so sort of focused on textbooks, right? And so that's how we got our information. And now there has been, with our curriculum in particular, a move towards more text-based primary source documents that teachers should be using within their classes. And so for me, what I found is that oftentimes if there is a controversial subject, or if there is a history that is just now starting to be corrected, like the Christopher Columbus discovered America, and that he was this great explorer, I think that primary sources can help to combat the uncomfortableness that might come in the teacher bringing that forward. And so for me, I love using that within my class. So I use his diary. I also use Bartolome de las Casas, the destruction of the Indies, as well. Because what I find is that when students are able to read it on their own, they say the things that we might not be able to say in the classroom, you know? So for instance, when they read Bartolome de las Casas and they find out that within the document, it talks about how the Native Americans were almost completely annihilated in multiple islands, then they're like, oh my God, like, why didn't we learn this history, or why didn't I know about that? Or they just want to talk about that in general. They learn new terms like Taino and Arawak, and then they have more questions like what is that, and what were the cultures that were here before? And then when we read Christopher Columbus' diary, and he talks about, he said something like, they seem very docile, and if it so pleases the king, I would like to carry some of them home. When the kids read that, as we're reading aloud, and we get to that part, they're like, carry them home? This is not like a vacation. They're not getting on a boat to go on, to go visit anyone. This is something where if you do that, then that means that you're literally kidnapping them. That's human trafficking. You're taking them from their home and you're carrying them to a different location. And so what I feel is that students are a lot more analytical and sort of invested in good history than a lot of people give them credit for. When you present primary sources to them in this manner, they're able to analyze it in a way that creates further discussion. And honestly speaking, I very rarely have to jump in and say much of anything. And occasionally they might say, Ms. Ridgeway, well, you asked us this question, or we're reading this primary source and you haven't said anything. And I'm like, I know, that's the point, because I'm not here to give you my point of view. I'm here for you to dissect and look at these documents, and then you are able to create your own point of view. And so I think that's really important. I try to be I think history is really important to give the information for students, and jump in when you need to, but let them hash it out. Because I feel like when they do that, they're able to grow even more as an analytical thinker. And I think that that leads to, when they become adults, they're able to make more informed choices, whether it be in politics or their own everyday lives or speaking with family. And I think that actually is the danger in allowing this sort of history to be taught, and why it's being limited. Because when you limit history, you prevent students from becoming critical thinkers. And because they're not critical thinkers, they're not able to make good decisions. And so that is why we need to, as much as possible, do research as history teachers and read books and be introduced to primary sources, so that if a parent comes in and say, why did you teach my child that? I can say, I didn't teach them anything. That was the primary source they read.
Well, that's the absolute dream, isn't it? When students are able to read something and reach their own conclusions. I think that's every history teacher's fantasy. So congratulations on doing that. Alexandra, do your history classes use primary sources? And if so, do you find them to be valuable sources of information and interpretation?
Yeah, they do. We're very lucky. We have like amazing history teachers at our school. and we have like a primary source binder that like it's specifically in AP US history. We have that, and it like sits in all the desks, and like usually pull it out at least like once a class. And I definitely think it is helpful. Like Miss Ridgeway was saying, I think a lot of us like will read stuff and we'll like say to each other like, oh my gosh, like this is crazy, like I didn't know about this, like what the heck. And our teachers don't really have to say too much about it. We're able to kind of make our own opinions about it, which is definitely a good thing.
Thank you. I know that when dealing with primary documents, I sort of feel myself pulled in two different directions. You know, there is this very fundamental desire to let the documents speak for themselves. But at the same time, and Keziah, this is probably mostly for you. Do you find yourself needing to provide context, or do you feel that you should provide context? And here I'm thinking particularly of outdated or hateful language that you don't want students, of course, to think that you're endorsing.
Yeah, so I actually start off the year by giving my students do's and don'ts. And so very early on, we actually discuss the N-word, for example, and we talk about like if that comes up within our reading, if we're reading aloud, should certain, like, can we say this? What should we say? And so first of all, I tell them the word is banned from my class. It's like just in general, like nobody's using it. And even I don't care, like you can't protest, like this is my rule. But if we're reading it, then I will tell my students, you know, just say N-word, like you don't have to say the whole thing. I think for something like that, you definitely have to give context to, especially there's one primary source where it is during the Reconstruction era, and one of the men is describing the ritual that he's receiving because he is trying to vote, and other people, Black men, are trying to vote, and so he like uses the word. And so when we read that out loud, you can like sort of see the kids' faces. They're like, oh, I don't know what to do with this. And then they remember like, oh, okay, I can just say N-word and it'll be okay. For words like Negro, where I've had students, like it's the cutest thing. They'll look at me and they're like, I don't think I can say this. I'm like, no, it's fine. It's fine. You can. It's not the same thing. You can say it, but like they'll even say like, you know what? I'm just not gonna say it. I'm just gonna skip over it. Sometimes you do have to provide context, right? Like I do think it's important for some documents to provide the context and prepare students for some things that might be particularly jarring. So you have to let them know like you're about to read something that might have offensive language, maybe language that you could be upset by. So I want to prepare you for that and let you know that it's coming. One example of that would be we're gearing up to read Abraham Lincoln's parts of his speech that he gave during the Lincoln-Douglas debates when he was running for Senate. And he had some like very harsh things to say about Black people. And the only context I provide is that I'm going to ruin Lincoln for you. And my students are like, how could you ruin Lincoln? What do you mean? Like, people? And I'm like, well, first of all, like we're not even going to talk about the Emancipation Proclamation because I'm going to ruin that for you too. So like, you know, with documents like that, I don't have to, I feel like for the most part, I don't have to provide a lot of context because the documents literally like speak for themselves. And when the kids do have questions like, well, how come, most of their questions will be along the lines of, well, how come we're taught Lincoln the Liberator and the Great Emancipator, but we're not taught this other side of Lincoln? And so to that, I always tell them, well, one thing that history has not done well is to uplift the fact that historical figures are complicated and they're human. And there are multiple different things that can be true about a historical figure. Lincoln, yes, he signed the Emancipation Proclamation, which did help to make the war about slavery and help usher in the end of this practice. But on the other hand, he was racist and he was a white supremacist. You have to understand that terminology, and you have to understand that students can grapple with that, right? And you still have kids that are like, well, you know what? Like, I think that what he did was amazing and needed to be done. And I'm also glad that later on in his life, he seemed to sort of course correct some of those initial ideologies about Black people, and it certainly became a closer with people like Frederick Douglass, right? And counted them as someone who might have been an advisor for him. So again, yeah, sometimes you may need to provide context, but I think that our students are really amazing and they're very intelligent beings, and just presenting multiple primary sources to them is honestly enough, I feel, to spark really important conversations where they come to various different conclusions that it might have been easier for a student to lead a teacher to lead them there, but they came to it on their own.
That's a really good point about setting out very clear expectations at the beginning of the year for how you're going to approach the content throughout. It's good preparation. I have one final question that I would like to pose to the panel in this part of the program. I know we have at least one question from the audience, so we'll turn to that next and open it up for a few more minutes as well. But what I want to ask you is, history is not the only subject that is being targeted by curricular restrictions. Certainly, we've seen even math textbooks come under fire, but it does seem to be an area of particular concern. Is my perception of that accurate? And if so, why? Why is history such a target? And this is for everyone.
I feel like I just talked, so I don't want to be like the mic hog. So I want to give Maura and Alexandra the opportunity to jump in first.
I think people are most challenged by history because it's something that people most often manipulate. I think it's something that, people tell themselves stories in their families of, who their ancestors were, what great people or what great things they did. Like, it's an area that I think there are people who are most upset by that, offended by that, and they feel it has the most direct impact on them. Biology is a lot of details and a lot of facts, math, but history is what shaped each of us in our own way. So it's had an impact on everyone. And I think people have a history that they want to be true because it affirms who they are now, who they are today. And what I think we really need to do is to learn from history, to be honest about it, to say what happened. Critical race theory is about being honest about the history of racism that's continued to the present day. And if we're not going to be honest about it, we're not being honest about who we are now. We're not being honest about what's really going on in our communities, in our society. So I think that history is a target because it is challenging who people think that they are, and they feel that if you say, actually, like, American history is bad, terrible things were done. Terrible things were done in the name of justice and religion and all sorts of things, right? So I think people, it's not just that they're uncomfortable, it somehow challenges who they want to say that they are or who they want to be. And the thing is, it's collective. Our history is collective. It isn't just an individual. It's actually important to recognize the interconnectedness and the intersectionality of all of us in this, our relatives did bad things happen. And if we are not willing to acknowledge that and learn from that, it's like not having social emotional intelligence. It's like not being true to ourselves about what's really happened and where we really are, in my view. That might be a long-winded answer. Thanks.
That's excellent. It's deeply personal to people, right? It challenges, as you've said, their very sense of self and identity and who they are and where they came from. So I think that's a great answer.
Okay. So I teach anthropology, and so I'm going to sort of approach this through an anthropological lens and think about power structures and just structures in general and hierarchy. And so most societies have some sort of hierarchy. And I think if we look at how our country started, and this idea of American exceptionalism has been at the core of developing the American identity, and also at the core of developing and aiding the structures that have been developed, whether it's education, politics, or judicial, whatever those structures are. And so I think it actually goes back to, it reminds me of a quote by Carter G. Woodson where he talks about, if you control a man's mind, you never have to tell him to go to the back door. Because once you would control his mind, he's going to go to that back door. And if the door is not available, he's going to build that back door, or something to that extent. But it's a reminder that history is powerful because it shines a light on the inaccuracies that we have been taught since the beginning of this country. This idea of American exceptionalism is nothing more than an idea. It's not reality. The country was literally, you didn't pull yourself up by your bootstraps or make something come from nothing. You literally built a country on the fields that were planted by the indigenous people of this land, using the labor of the indigenous people and of Africans. And understanding that can not only shake your core sense of who you are, as Maura stated, but it also, in a way, can, if the history gets out and people really start to understand who we are and how to be better, because you can't know how to get better as a country if you don't know what has happened. It sort of speaks to this idea of power and who has power. And if kids are able to learn the true history of our country, then who has power may look very, very different than what it does right now. And so history is attacked because it literally is the core of teaching who we are. It's how the American identity was developed over time. And so that I think that it's really important that kids learn this history so that when they become adults, they can make informed decisions when it comes to politics and when it comes to who should be leading our country. And so I think the limiting of this is a way for people to maintain their hold on power.
I completely agree. I think what Miss Ridgeway said reminded me of a quote that I've kind of kept with me ever since, like, a lot of the book controversy started within my district. But it's from Sada Shakur, and it's, no one is going to give you the education you need to overthrow them. Nobody's going to teach you your true heroes if they know that knowledge will help set you free. And I completely agree with like what Miss Ridgeway said. A lot of these people who are in favor of like these curricular restrictions are in positions of power. They've been raised in them and taught to believe that these like power structures are right. And I think a big reason why they don't want, students learning about history is that they know that like knowledge of history does grant, the people the power to kind of like overthrow them, I guess, in their positions, and therefore they don't want history to be very accessible. I also think compassion is kind of part of it. In my opinion, like the people who favor curricular restrictions are kind of like aiming to make things that they don't like or like agree with kind of like taboo or evil or just like completely not real. And in my opinion, at least, I think them like prohibiting the sharing and learning of history is almost like a ploy to like destroy like compassion and like recognition of like humanity for people and groups and things that they don't like, and in a way just completely erase them, which is pretty terrifying.
That's really well said. I mean, I know that I personally, as a historian, I love researching and writing and teaching about folks whom I disagree with. I think that can be absolutely fascinating. Alexander, I cannot think of a more perfect place to sort of segue into a different portion of this program than Assata Shakur. Thank you so much for bringing that in. That's not only a perfect sentiment to express, but just a perfect example of why we need inclusive women's history. So we do have two questions in the Q&A. And this first one, Maura, maybe you would be the best person to answer this. Bonnie Zedek asks, to what extent are teacher preparation programs at the college/university level affected by curriculum restrictions, book banning, and narrowing of the perspective of what history is, such as exclusion of Black women's history? How should university teacher preparation programs prepare students for this environment in pre-K to 12th grade education? Great question, Bonnie. Thank you.
That's a really great question. I wish I had a really great answer. I do not, but I can say that this is not something I've been involved in. Some teacher preparation classes and I teach some things on like special education law and different issues that may intersect in terms of teacher preparation. And the notion of sort of that curriculum, they're learning about the standards, they're learning about actually teaching the Common Core, which is a lot about critical thinking. It's a lot about how do we impart that. So they are being prepared not for maybe the world that they're coming into in terms of policies that we're seeing now. So I think that's really seen as being more of a political context rather than sort of what do you need in order to acquire the knowledge and skills to teach the subject matter. So I think the teacher preparation is focused on teaching techniques, and sort of learning about classroom management, learning about all of those skills. I don't know enough, and maybe other people on this panel, I'm looking at you, do, about sort of what preparation they're getting about what is curriculum. Curriculum has often been thought of as being fairly standardized across the state. We have a very rich chapter 4 that goes through what the state standards are. There's an appendix to it. It has a lot of detail. And now in the Common Core standards, I know this because of the school funding case and trying it for almost 4 months, we have a lot of information that is utilized, in terms of teacher support to sort of do that and to accomplish that in an effective way. But these issues and the politics around sort of curriculum and how we're teaching it is really uncharted territory, as far as I know, in terms of teachers being aware of this minefield. And a lot of this, up until this point, has not been happening in our schools, where we have been indicting the curriculum and saying we're not going to teach history and we have to get rid of all of these subjects. So this is very, very new as far as I know. Thanks.
My knowledge of these issues raised in this particular question are only anecdotal. I do have friends and colleagues who are involved in teacher training programs at colleges and universities. I think of one in particular who runs the history teacher training program at the University of Iowa, and she does find it tremendously frustrating that she's put. And in Iowa, they have different things that you're allowed to say and not say at different levels. So even though at the college level, you may be able to take it a step further than you can at the primary school level, she's still put in the position of having to decide, whether she's going to tell her trainees what they can and cannot say. But again, that's just anecdotal. We also have a question from an anonymous attendee who asks, I also wondered about the impact of social media on our understanding of history and controversy. Is it part of the problem, or does it have a positive impact? And I think I'm going to pose that to Alexandra. You can be the face of Gen Z.
Yeah, sure. I think social media has been helpful in a lot of ways, honestly. At least for me personally, I think it has given me, obviously like a space to learn more about things that we haven't been taught in school. There's like tons of good YouTube videos and even like TikTok videos sometimes that like outline historical events and talk about different concepts that are really important, which I think is a very good thing. And yeah, I think especially during quarantine too, like a lot of younger people were able to, use the internet and learn more about history and, politics and different things that they feel like are important, which I think is a good thing, especially as like us teens, I guess you could say, or like growing into adults and like developing our own ideas, getting a sense of all different viewpoints and just learning about stuff that we want to learn is important, and social media kind of allows us to do that.
Great point. Thank you. Do either of the other panelists want to weigh in on that question at all?
So I was just gonna say, like, I agree with Alexandra. I think social media is a blessing and a curse. And I was just talking about this in my class the other day, where the kids were talking about like some of the challenges that are being sort of promulgated on TikTok. And I'm like, I don't see those things because I guess that's not like what my algorithm is. But I actually made a TikTok account to post videos about history because my students encouraged me to. They kept coming into class saying, "Oh, I heard that Lincoln was a vampire," like just silly, crazy things. And I'm like, "Where did you see this from?" And they're like, "TikTok." So I'm like, "Okay." So my first response was stay off of TikTok. And then as I would like explain to them why what they are saying is craziness, then they were like, "Well, Miss Ridgeway, you should make a TikTok. Like people would like really like follow you because you know what you're talking about." And so I made a TikTok, and I do have some students follow me, and sometimes they repost things, and it's really cool because I feel like kids have a hunger for getting like real information and truthful information. And so I think if teachers have the capacity to do it, that's one of the things that they just need to wade in and just do it.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that there's a plethora of information out there. And if we're not giving our kids the skills to be critical thinkers and to analyze that information, again, we go back to your point of not making good choices, and there is a lot of information that is not accurate, that is not right. And it's very difficult to figure out unless you're working with primary sources, unless you learn that skill. Oh, I see. That's why primary sources are important. This is, someone told someone else what happened. Maybe that's not what happened, right? So I think it underscores the importance of having that strong foundation in our schools that allows children to learn those skills that they really desperately need to navigate all of the information that they are bombarded with, and to try to separate the wheat from the chaff, or however you want to say it. Thanks.
Do we have any other questions from the audience? So we are at about 7:50 here, believe it or not. I had fully intended to switch gears a little while ago, but I'm so fascinated by what you all had to say. I've learned quite a bit. I do want just to talk you through the packet that we've put together for you, because this is really the role that I see institutions like HSP playing in combating curricular restrictions, is to put the primary sources out there, to provide students and educators and activists with access to them. And so the activities that I've put together are really intended to do that, to put primary documents that can ideally lead students to their own conclusions about history in classrooms and other settings. So just to remind you, all of this is available in the Google Drive folder that you should have received earlier. What you're going to find here is a packet of 3 different activities, one of which has to do with images of women in sports over the course of about the 50 years before Title IX, one of which has to do with the Equal Rights Amendment and actually the debate within the feminist movement over the Equal Rights Amendment in the 1940s and 1950s. And then the third exercise is about reproductive rights and provides different perspectives thereon, not just abortion, but also issues like forced sterilization. So I hope that you will take a look at those and encourage other teachers you know to use them as well. You'll also find in that same folder all of the documents available for you to download to use in your own classes. So we have everything put together in the packet, but then also the individual documents if you want to pull those out. Any other final thoughts from panelists or questions from the audience?
I just wanted to point out that Alexandra is an amazing advocate, and she has done amazing things in Central Bucks and really shown so much leadership. And, you know, I just think, Alexandra, you are such a wonderful example of why we need to have an expansive, diverse curriculum, why we need inclusive schools, and why we need an accurate education for all of our children. So I just wanted to commend you on being incredibly brave. It's we've gone to some of the board meetings. The Education Law Center has submitted letters. We've done some advocacy. It's not easy. It's a very challenging environment to be yourself and to advocate for your position. And I just want to commend you on doing such an incredible job. And I also, Keziah, I just wanted to commend you on being such an incredible teacher and really being so incredibly and providing such a rich environment and education for all of your students and for teaching them the skills that they need in life. And I'm really, I'm just very inspired by both of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maura. First of all, I kind of fangirled when I found out you were on the team that put that lawsuit together. I actually have been following that lawsuit for the past few years and was like really waiting to see the outcome of it. And when the verdict was reached, we actually, in my school, the teachers were in a teacher's lounge. And another teacher was like, they reached a verdict. And I was like, wait, what? Like, I was not even aware that we were at that point where a decision was going to be made. And so I want to thank you for, and the rest of the lawyers and all the people that were involved in bringing that lawsuit, because I feel like finally something that we all knew that work within the education world now is out there, and hopefully we will get to a point where now the state can actually do something about it, and we can actually start to rectify the mismatch in funds that have been given to other areas within the state of Pennsylvania. So thank you so much. In a past life, I would have been a lawyer, but I ended up being a teacher. So I'm always appreciative of people who do go into law and advocate for the greater good of society. And Alexandra, I have to piggyback off of what Maura said and say that you are a phenomenal young woman. I have 2 daughters, and if they grow up to have half of the compassion that you have and the intelligence that you have, then as a mother, that will make me the proudest mom. So I don't know if I could ever be of any help or any service to you and the fellow students and your fight for those rights of others and for curriculum and access to books that everyone should have. But if there's any way that I can be of any help, or I can use my voice to uplift anything that you're saying or anything that is being said there, please don't hesitate to reach out.
You guys are gonna make me cry. Thank you so much. It's just really sweet. I'm so honored to be here today and be with 3 beautiful, compassionate, strong, wonderful women. And I don't know, this is just absolutely amazing. I'm so thankful for all of you, and yeah, I really appreciate it.
That's all wonderfully, wonderfully said. It's not at all a coincidence that the 3 of you ended up on this panel. You're not only amazing scholars and public intellectuals, you're doing incredible work in the community. And it was quite intentional that I wanted to wrangle the 3 of you into this. So thank you. That is our time for tonight, unfortunately. A huge, huge thank you to our panelists. We're so lucky to have you and your expertise and your compassion here to educate us. I'm thrilled to have you in the HSP orbit, and I hope that we'll continue to work together in the future. Those of you who are attending, I'm thrilled to have you in the HSP orbit as well. I hope that you are subscribed to our newsletter. If you're not, you can check it out at hsp.org/enews. We have a number of additional programs coming up, including on April 18th, when we will be discussing the work on digitizing records that we've been doing with Clive Dinn of the National Trust and the papers of the Chu families, which is in the vein of this program in that it is about learning how to use 18th and 19th century documents to teach about enslaved people and their families and their lives. And this is intended to be a hybrid program. So again, thank you so much. You're making tremendous contributions, and I'm very lucky to witness it. So thank you everyone for coming, and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.